We can distinguish three different periods in the migration towards Belgium after the Second World War. First, there is an organized labor migration in the reconstruction years and in the golden 60s. Then, after the crisis of 1973, the petroleum crisis, there is a second period until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And finally, a third period starts with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 and the enlargement of the European Union, and especially after the years 2000. But here I will only talk about this first period, immediately after the war. One of the fundamental characteristics of this first period was that it was essentially an organized labor migration, organized by the Belgian government together with the Belgian mine bosses. It was in this period mainly a male migration and of male workers that were less qualified. This first period can also be subdivided in three. We have the Italian decenny until 1956. Then we have the second part when we have an enlargement of the migration towards the whole of the Mediterranean Sea basin, and where we can see that not only workers are going towards the coal mines anymore, but to the whole of the Belgian heavy industry. And we have a third period after the recession of 1967, when more and more draconian measures are taken by the Belgian government against migrants who lose their job and were often obliged to quit the country. In 1945, in this first period, the Belgian coal production was about half the production from before the war. In 1946, for instance, 165,000 Belgian miners were working in the Belgian mines. Among them, 95,000 Belgians, about 31,000 immigrant workers, more than 36,000 prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, and also 3,000 people who are imprisoned after the war. The prisoners of war, the German prisoners of war, has to be released by the Belgian government, and it was because of that that Achille van Acker, prime minister at the time and also minister of coal production, decided to make a bilateral agreement with Italy, where about 50,000 Italian miners have to be recruited to come to work in the Belgian mines. But the conditions of work in the Belgian mines were very heavy, very difficult, and also the conditions of life were extremely poor at that moment. And for some young people from Italy coming directly from the countryside and going in the mine, it was like hell. In a report of the National Bank of 1947, one can read, the recruitment of Italian workers that has to replace the German prisoners of war repatriated has not responded at the results that we hoped of. At the end of April, several hundreds Italians have already deserted the mine, often after only a few days of presence. Some of them have been placed in the quarries and in the heavy industry, with the agreement of the competent authorities, because their refusal of descending in the mine was considered appropriate. But others disappeared in the clandestinity and started an activity that was not permitted by their contract of immigration. End of quote. A lot of these people who deserted the mine will be arrested afterwards and repatriated to Italy. But others will come to Liège or Brussels, for instance, and will start to live in the neighborhoods where the Italian community was already present before the Second World War. For instance, in Saint-Gilles, Anderlecht, and Molenbeek. It was the catastrophe of 1956 of Marcinelle, of the mine Bois du Casier, that made an end at this first decenny. More than 262 miners died in the catastrophe. And it was the end of the agreement between the Italian government and the Belgian government. But at the same period, the Belgian government started to enlarge the recruitment of immigrant workers to the whole Mediterranean Sea basin. Agreements have been done with Spain of Franco, with Greece, and later on in 1964 with Turkey and Morocco. In 1955, 1957, a peak of more than 70,000 immigrant workers came to Belgium. And this new migration was also not only destined anymore to the coal mines only, but to the whole of the heavy industry and also to construction work. Brussels was at that moment the most important workers' town of Belgium. And especially along the canal, there were multiple small enterprises looking for workers. So we can say that the geographical focus of the migration was not any longer the coal mine regions, but more and more it was Brussels. At the moment that the Brussels region has been formed in 1971, there were more than 170,000 manual workers in Brussels. Some of them were also working in very large factories. Think about the automobile factories, for instance, Citroën, Renault, and Volkswagen. In the Michelin factory, for instance, with more than 1,000 workers, about 90% of the workers were of immigrant background. It is also the period of big construction works in Brussels. We have the Expo of 1958, the construction of the tunnels of the small ring, the start of the bigger ring around Brussels, the viaduct of Koekelberg, and also the demolition of the Quartier Nord, nearby the Gare du Nord, for the so-called Manhattan Plan, a plan that has happily never been completely realized. But the destruction of this popular neighborhood made that more than 70,000 people have to be displaced. Many migrant families that started to live afterwards more in Anderlecht and Molenbeek. The third period will start with the recession of the end of the 60s, when the Belgian government becomes much more restrictive and starts to have even discriminatory measures towards immigrant workers who become unemployed. When an immigrant worker lost his employment, often he was obliged to return to his country. But it was in 1973, with the petroleum crisis, that this period ended finally. In 1974, the Belgian government decided to make an end at the labor migration. And that year we have also a peak in migration because a lot of migrant workers, afraid of the future, let come their families to Belgium. It was the beginning of the international and multicultural city of Brussels we know nowadays. Of course, there were also these international institutions, international organizations here in Brussels, especially, of course, the European Union, that contributed to this internationalization of the population in Brussels. But at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, the international migration started also to encompass the whole of the world, from Chile to Brazil, to Pakistan and India and Cambodia. People from all over the world were coming to live in Brussels.